Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, HWS. Fantastic tournament. All right, so we think this is a pretty straightforward question. A reasonable standard of living, you can live a fairly decent life. We're not saying starve yourself, satisfy your basic needs, but at that point, any other luxury you buy, we say instead of doing that, donate to those who haven't fulfilled this reasonable standard of living. That's the case we're going to present to you today on proposition. I'm going to give you three main arguments. We're going to talk to you about moral principles, and a whole bunch of them, and why we think in terms of morality, the case definitely falls on this side of the house. We're going to talk to you about individual betterment, and we're going to talk about here about both actors involved in this debate, those who will be the recipients of this aid and those donating this aid. And lastly, we're going to talk to you about social cohesion, and why we think in a meaningful sense humanity comes together more when you have this kind of bill. But right at the top, we want to be very clear about something in this debate. We don't think it's sufficient for Op to come up here and start saying that rich people have a right to keep their money. So we recognize rich people have a right to the fruits of their labors. The question of this debate is what should they do with it? We're saying that they should donate it to those less in need. Okay, let's get into the moral principles we're going to be standing on our side of the house. And there's a number of them. The first we're going to stand on is a categorical imperative, right? So this idea of the categorical imperative is that you act in such a way that the maxim of your action or the motivation of your action could become a universal law. So what does this mean, right? You're going to see two fundamentally different maxims from prop and from op. From prop, you're going to hear that I'm going to help those in need when I have the capability to do so. From op, you're going to hear that I'm not going to do this, I'm going to use that money to derive happiness from ourselves. But we think in order for something to truly be a moral law, it shouldn't be situationally dependent. It should be true for people who are advantaged and for people who are disadvantaged. We don't think you can say any law is truly moral if it only applies for those who are advantaged. So let's then analyze these two conflicting maxims that you're going to hear in this debate. Is ours universal? Absolutely, we think it is. We think that if you're a person disadvantaged, you absolutely want there to be a universal law wherein people help those in need. But even if you're rich, even if you're wealthy, you still want to be helped if you ever turn in need. That's something that's very important to recognize. Even those who are advantaged, even those who are wealthy, I'll take it in a second, still want to be helped where and when the situation arises and when they're in need. So I think on this side of the house, you do see the kind of moral law of helping others in need that can be applied. Go ahead.
So then why wouldn't you support a situation in which I could save two other people by donating my organs? Why shouldn't I kill myself in order to help them?
Okay, so this is what we're going to be talking about, right? Because this is fundamentally different from killing yourself. You're only restricting yourself to a reasonable standard of living, thereby ensuring that everyone benefits, right? This isn't even necessarily a case of a trade-off in the extent that he's talking about, because we're not talking about killing yourself, we're talking about restricting yourself to a reasonable standard of living. I think that's a completely different fact. So we've proven to you that our moral conception here is universal, applies to people who are advantaged and are not. Does theirs? Does this idea, if I'm only going to keep money to myself and use it to my individual betterment, actually apply universally? It helps those who are advantaged, but if you are poor, if you're a person who is in suffering and unable to actualize their most basic needs, you would by all means reject this type of universal law. I don't think on those grounds it can become a universal law of morality. The second principle we're going to stand on is just John Stuart Mill, the idea of utilitarianism. The greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. We think in the status quo, happiness is extremely concentrated, wherein a few people at the very top can derive massive amounts of satisfaction from luxuries. But you have people at the very bottom who are not even able to grasp this concept and come close to it. We think at the end of the day, equalizing this happiness is a principle we're going to stand on as well. And lastly, we're going to talk to you about treating humanity as an end in itself, and bettering humanity just for the sake of having humankind as a condition bettered. We think humankind and humanity as a condition is meaningfully hurt when there are so many people at the bottom of humanity who are not even able to conceive and actualize those rights which make people human. We're going to get into that more in our argument of individual rights, but recognize that insofar as in the status quo we have people who are unable to attain a reasonable standard of living, we think humanity as a condition is hurt when it's only a few people exceptionally able to do so. So, let's get on to individual rights. Because what we're going to say on this side of the house is that the recipients benefit and the donors benefit as well. But before that, I'll take you.
Who makes the goods in a capitalist economy?
Oh, okay. So we're going to talk about capitalist economies and all that as well. But this idea that, look, I've made the goods, therefore I have a right to it, right? This idea, apparently what they're going to talk about is like trickle-down economics probably, that look, everyone gets like good when we have a capitalist system. This flies in the fact of the face that people still suffer, right? Like if happiness is trickling down, great, there's no need to donate, right? But clearly there's still an incentive and a need and people who have need of money to be donated. So clearly the system right now isn't fixing that. So let's continue on about individual rights. We think it's important to recognize that when we say, with like rhetoric, that people all have some inalienable rights which make them human, then it's also important that they have some capacity to fulfill those rights. And I would posit to you that someone starving, someone living under constant threat of persecution, someone who doesn't even have the most basic standard of living that we would expect of humanity, is not meaningfully able to actualize those rights that are supposed to make them human, right? The very basic rights that we give to people. We think someone starving is meaningfully unable to enact things like freedom of movement and all other sorts of freedoms and the pursuit of happiness. We think it's meaningfully harmed. So insofar as these individuals aren't able to tap into what makes them human, we think that gives you another obligation to do so. These people who have met this reasonable standard of living have already achieved to some degree what it is to be human. And we'd say that there's something to be said for bettering the human condition as a whole and helping others attain that standard as well before you seek to go beyond that. So we say that's important as well. Moreover, when we talk about individual incentives, it's also important to realize that the donor benefits. We think it's a very high stage of human life to not just pursue your own happiness, but that of others as well. I think this is the kind of moral that a lot of religious groups try to instill in people. And we think if people more actively take upon themselves this kind of moral value, you see individuals gaining great satisfaction from this practice as well, so the donors benefit as well. Lastly, social cohesion. We'd say some of the worst conflicts in the world are fought over inequality and fought over people who perceive themselves to be lagging behind others and perceive themselves as not receiving the just outcomes of their work. We'd say, looking at any resource war that has ever taken place in the world, of which there are many, these conflicts are directly linked to the fact that there are some people who are so poorly off in their society, who have not met a reasonable standard of living, that in order to try and improve their situation, they turn to violent ends. Also, this manifests itself in this general apathy towards others in society, where you see polarization of people based on the haves and the have-nots. I think this kind of bill, where those who have something, have resources, reach out to those who don't, meaningfully improves relations between the two of those, and by doing so, meaningfully improves relations between all of humanity as it exists today. If those who have resources, if those who have basic rights, reach out to those who don't, I think the human condition is improved not just in terms of poverty, but in terms of actual bonds between us and bonds between all of us. I think those meaningfully benefit when you see people reaching out to each other. It reduces conflict in a very direct way, but in a more intangible way, I think we all feel more connected to each other, regardless of socioeconomic status, when we choose to forego our right to pursue luxuries and instead make sure that people are able to meet their most basic of rights on those grounds we propose.
I thank that speaker very much for his remarks, and this House is now very pleased to recognize the leader of the opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now, it would be okay, I think, for us on opposition here to take the easy way out and just say, well, we don't think you have to, but maybe you should in certain circumstances. But we're going to stand on our side of the House. It's a bit of a harder line. What we're going to say is that you, as an individual who has more wealth than necessary to meet a basic standard of living, should only give charity to the extent that it makes you happy. You should not, in any sense, incorporate the utility of those that you're going to be helping. We're going to give you 3 reasons as to why we think that's the case. Obviously, this isn't something that we necessarily believe in real life, in case this is being filmed, but we think that we can make a go of it. So before I get to that, let me just talk about a philosophical tension, which I already raised in a point of information, but which I think is extremely damaging for this proposition. They told you that they have 2 philosophies. They told you that their first philosophy is to help the maximum number of people, and that's why you should be trying to keep yourself alive. But they also told you that they want to create the maximum overall utility, the John Stuart Mill utilitarianism. What I told you is these things cannot coexist, because if you look at a situation in which, for example, I could kill myself to save 3 more people, that is a situation in which you would be increasing overall utility, even though there would be fewer people around. So we think they need to pick one of these 2 scenarios, but we're going to show you why either sort of weighing is actually impossible to do in the real world, and why therefore you should look only to your own utility. But before I get to that, let's talk about dessert. And I don't mean the stuff that tastes good. I mean what is owed to you. Now, what we think on our side of the house is that there are good things that people do and bad things that people do, and we can say those sorts of things from basic universal principles. Even though we don't know how much it hurts someone when you punch them, we can still say it's a bad thing, it hurts them somewhat, and therefore you deserve to be punished. And if you punch 2 people, you probably deserve to be punished approximately twice as much than if you punch 1 person. This is why, as a society, we think that it's just to punish people who do ill to others, who actively initiate an action that makes someone else worse off. And we would think that this is justified and obligatory for us to do as a society, even if there weren't any deterrent value. Which is to say, we do think that in itself, the fact that you've committed a wrong action makes you deserving of punishment. On the flip side, we think the fact that you have done something good for society makes you deserving of a benefit. That you deserve something more than what you would have done had you not benefited society. And so I'm going to spend the rest of this point explaining why we think most of the time, or on average, when someone is wealthy, it is as a result of having done good for other people, and why, therefore, they deserve to keep what they have made. There are a number of reasons for this, but the simplest is the following thought experiment. If you assume for a moment that society involves a free exchange of goods and services in which only consenting individuals make transactions, then if I sell you something and make $1 million, it is because you believed that you would get more than $1 million worth of value out of those goods or services. And when I say you, it could be you individually, Eric Barnes, or it could be the entire panel or the entire room that cumulatively valued my production, or the production that I was capable of bringing to bear at least $1 million. Now, obviously, we do not live in a perfect society in which everyone plays exactly by the rules and in which everyone is perfectly deserving of the wealth that they have come to. But we do think that because we do punish people as a society for doing things that are harmful, we think, generally speaking, our society does a pretty good job of rewarding those who have created goods for others with wealth, and a pretty good job, overall, again, on average, of doling this out in such a way. And so we think, as a consequence, because you have helped others, because you have created a value that others viewed, and I'll take you in a second, as worth at least what you've made, we think that that is proportional to the amount of good that you've done, and therefore proportional to the amount that you should keep. Go ahead.
No one's saying that rich people didn't earn their money legitimately. What we're saying is they should redistribute it. You're saying what they can do with their money. We're saying what they should do.
Right. So what we're saying is, if you are a wealthy person, you've done good for others, you deserve to have more utility because you've done something for others. Just like if you've done something bad to other people, you deserve to be punished. You deserve to have your utility diminished. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk about is the difficulty of comparing utility functions. And this responds quite nicely to the idea that they have, that happiness is concentrated in a small group at the top. Perhaps this is true, but I don't know how they can actually make a statement like this, how they can actually compare my utility function to the utility function of someone on their team, or someone in another country, or someone in a different time throughout history. I think it's actually impossible to say, well, this dollar makes me X happy, but this dollar would make that person over there Y happy, and have X and Y have the same units. We just don't think that individuals are capable of making determinations like this, and we don't think that anyone sort of in a position outside of humanity would also be able to compare individuals' utility functions. Several reasons why this is the case. Firstly, we think someone that you offer this money to might not actually become happy by it. There's lots of people who, when they have more money, aren't actually happier. We think also you might hurt other people, either intentionally or unintentionally, with the wealth that's been given from you. So, for example, you might give money to someone who needs to feed himself in another place. That person might grow up to be a well-intentioned politician who ends up passing laws that cause, complete economic destruction. We don't think that you can say a priori feeding this person is a good idea just because there are so many ways that things could go well or badly. Furthermore, the money that you give in order to help people might only help them survive for a short period of time. And we think it's impossible to say, 6 months of this other person's life is worth X in terms of the amount of your life in which you don't have a yacht or a private plane or even a nice house. We think that those things are actually impossible to compare. And we think also, and most perniciously, the fact that you are trying to help others might actually make them worse off in the long run. We think that much of the quote-unquote good or charity that individuals try to undertake actually leads to perverse incentives, where, for example, the fact that we are giving free food to people in certain African countries means that there's a diminished incentive for the farmers within those countries to produce food and create an overall self-sustaining system that is able to provide food for the entire country. And we think oftentimes these gifts are unclear in their eventual effect. The law of unintended consequences could take 10, 20, or 100 years to take effect, but we think and as a consequence, we think it's incredibly difficult and nearly impossible to make these judgments for yourself. And given this uncertainty then, we think that you ought to defer to that person whose utility you can measure, which is yours. Finally, we think that there's a greatly diminished incentive for individuals on their side of the house to work, both when they receive charity and when they produce this output in society. And this will be something we discuss further, but suffice it to say, we think individuals should keep what they've made unless it makes them happy. We're proud.
I thank that speaker very much for his remarks, and now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Somewhat ironically, I have a political theory exam on Tuesday that I skipped studying to come here and debate. I feel slightly vindicated. I'm going to make, I think, one semi-new argument, then I'm going to talk about what Goldstein told you, then I'm going to talk about what Vinu told you and what few responses we got. So first of all, why is there poverty in the world? Because Goldstein would have you believe that individuals are rich or poor based on their own choices, that individuals work to achieve wealth, and that if you work hard enough, you can. I am going to posit to you, Mr. Speaker, that everyone in this room has won the lottery of birth, and we have a much easier road to wealth and happiness than would someone in the third world country. I think that is the single biggest determinant of whether or not you are able to generate the kind of wealth that both opposition and proposition think are actually good for society. There are huge structural barriers to the poor, barriers that are exacerbated when rich people hoard their money in bank accounts instead of buying food for the hungry and medicine for the sick. You exacerbate those problems on that side of the house. Okay, what did Goldstein say? So, he takes the standard that you're only going to donate if it makes you happy. So Vinu's already talked about how morality really ought to be applied in a polarized question. Is this action moral or is it not? And the same answer would presumably follow the same set of circumstances in any circumstance. Goldstein interprets this to say, well look, I could save 2 people, or potentially even more than 2 people, by killing myself and donating my organs. But note, Mr. Speaker, that if you applied that as a universal maxim, humanity would cease to exist because we would all be killing ourselves. On our side of the house, society becomes more equal because we all have relatively more modest. The rich have to suffer a little bit, but everyone is, generally speaking, better off. Then he makes this long capitalist argument that you need to punish those who would do ill to others and reward those who do good things for society. So first of all, I think I've already dealt a little bit with why those who are poor in the status quo are not necessarily any more worthy of punishment, no thank you, or worthy of their poverty than would be anyone else in a similar circumstance. I think, Mr. Speaker, that were we in this room, born into that kind of poverty, we would want Gov to win because then our lives would be better. I would furthermore point out, Mr. Speaker, that there are far more people who are wanting of this help than would be reticent to provide it if side opposition got their way. You increase the number of people who are able to lead a meaningful life. I've already talked to you a little bit about structural barriers to a reasonable standard of living, but I'll take that.
Okay. Your claim is that if rich people were poor, they would want to be helped, and that's why it should be a universal law. If poor people were rich, could they not endorse a categorical imperative where they wanted to be allowed to keep their stuff?
So potentially, but our argument is that that is a worse world to live in, and therefore we should want to live in our world where everyone is moderately better off. It is true that individuals on the rich side of that equation will always want to keep their money. But I think moral questions ought to be decided if we didn't know which side we'd end up on, which world we should live in. Obviously, if we know we're going to win the lottery of birth, if we know we're going to be rich, we might, as side opposition tell you, want to keep all of our money. More on that in a second. But if we're born not with lots of money, if we're born into abject poverty and facing huge barriers to becoming wealthy, we would want this policy in place. And again, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to posit that there are a hell of a lot more of those people than rich ones. It's empirically true. Now we hear from Goldstein an extremely silly argument. You can't compare objectively the utility of $5 to a rich person to $5 to someone in poverty. It's just $5. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to suggest that their Ferrari fund. Furthermore, I think it's more objectively valuable to all of society if the individual is able to eat, is able to drink, is able to live and actualize in society than if you get like, I don't know, 1/100,000th of the price of your Ferrari. I think that's objectively more valuable to society than the alternative. You can compare utility, we're happy to, on-site government.
Sir.
Thank you. The next claim he makes, and he makes two claims, but they're essentially the same. Look, if you donate this money, it will have bad effects. People will grow up from poor countries, and they will be evil. So, first of all, your moral decision-making ought hinge on what you are trying to do. I think individuals who donate money to the poor in developing countries, to other causes in society, do so, no thank you, not because they want to foster evil, but because they want to make the world a better place. And that striving to do that is a profoundly moral thing. But furthermore, I'll take you in a moment, I question on face the likelihood of this occurring. I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, that if you buy 20,000 people vaccines that would save their lives, you're going to get like 19,998 of them that are extremely happy and good and moral actors in society, and you might get a couple bad apples, but I think those are far more likely on Goldstein's side of the house, and I'll explain why after his PO.
Okay, so now your philosophy is you should do something with good intentions regardless of the outcome. Don't you think by giving this money, you could actually be leading to perverse incentives that make people worse off in the long run?
The perverse incentive of having clean water? I don't understand. I just honestly don't. But lastly, I think a society that is profoundly unequal, as Vinu tells you, is a society where the evil people that Goldstein wants to eliminate are far more likely to grow up hating the West, hating the rich, because they're the ones that have been disadvantaged and see the system, not unreasonably, as screwing them over and leaving them in abject poverty compared to the relative wealth and riches of those who have money. Their side of the house makes evil people more likely. What did Vinu tell you? He talked to you about a bunch of moral principles and how if you're going to act in a moral way, in order for an action to be moral, if everyone took the same action, it would have to be the same as well. I think side opposition, and then responds to this in a point about capitalism, where he's like, look, who would make the goods? So this is extremely hyperbolic for him to say. Note that lots and lots of rich people donate their riches anyway. I would point out that having numbers in a bank account is not particularly valuable, either to the individual whose numbers those are, or to society as a whole. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, beyond a reasonable standard of living, it's all for luxuries, and I think those luxuries, those funds, those resources, would be far better allocated to the poor, to the needy in society. I think that's hugely important. Mr. Speaker, we've shown you that were we not to know how our world would set up, what role we would play in society, we would want a more equal society, and that's only achieved on our side of the house. We are proud of that.
We thank that speaker very much for his remarks, and now welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to start with some rebuttal, which is essentially going to be an analysis of exactly how strong of a position this side is actually taking and how strong of a position they want you to think they're taking. And this is going to lead into a bit of a defense on the points that Adam gives you about utility and perverse incentives. And then I'm going to get into my new constructive matter, which is on exactly how this impacts society that supports this moral philosophy as far as how people work, what the incentives are within the economy, and what this means for jobs and production within society. So realize that what we're talking about here is that any time you have money that could be spent on luxury or could be donated to ameliorating suffering, meaning any time that you've already met some basic subsistence level of standard of living, you should be donating it to the poor. So the standard that they want to try to defend, or what they make you think they're defending, is there are these ludicrously rich people out there that don't need their money, and they should be giving that money away to African nations so that they have clean water to drink. But the standard that they're actually supporting in the motion is that any time that you could choose to purchase luxury, anytime you could bring yourself above some basic, very basic level of living, you should not do that and should instead donate to something else, donate to someone else. So I would posit that there is a lot of suffering in the world. Everyone would not acknowledge that. And I would even say that there's so much suffering in the world that anytime that you have the potential to buy luxuries, you're going to be in the position that you're going to have to instead donate it to someone to ameliorate suffering if you're going to uphold their moral philosophy. So when you acknowledge that this is what we're talking about, that we're talking about not just taking away money that ridiculously rich people don't need and giving it away to help poor people, but saying that everyone is not moral, would not be right in bringing themselves above some very basic level of living, then it's much easier to understand the position that Adam has given us, which is that it is very difficult to compare utility across people. So they're not very generous at all in this, and I think it's because they don't understand it. A great example of how it's not very easy to compare utility across people is, yes, if several people in this room, or everyone in this room, decided that they were going to live at just a very basic standard for their entire life and not purchase any luxuries, donated all that money, they could probably save a couple people in Africa who are starving, a couple people who are dying. They could provide for food for their entire life to also bring them up to that basic level of living. But the question of whether or not it's worth taking everyone in this room and bringing them down to a basic level in which they are not allowed to have any luxury and still be moral, the question of whether or not that is more utility than whether or not that is taking away more utility than it is generating by just bringing up two people from the point of starving to the point of being the same as the rest of us is not an easy question to answer. I'll take you on that point. For opening.
Is the world a better place if I drive a Mercedes or if I drive a Ford and 10,000 people get vaccines?
Okay, so what we're telling you is that this position that you want to defend, this position that only ridiculously rich people are affected by this policy is simply not true. But the reason we got a definition of luxury is because we wanted to understand that it means something that you don't need, right? So something that you don't need defines a lot of things that we like to have in our lives, a lot of things that make our lives better. If you uphold the standard of this notion, you are saying that once we have our basic needs met, once we all have food, once we all have shelter, we should be giving all our money elsewhere. The argument here is that you cannot compare the utility that I would have over my entire life of having a higher quality of life, a quality of life in which I get to enjoy some luxury, to the utility that someone else gets from meeting up to that basic standard of living as well, not at this time, thanks. So on this same argument, I think that the other issue of comparing utility is the idea of perverse incentives. So they also just kind of threw this argument out without giving you any kind of generous address whatsoever, and I think that was a really poor strategic decision on their part, because the perverse incentive argument is actually legitimate. What it means is that this is just another way in which it's difficult for us to assess utility across different people. So yes, it seems on face that if you give money to provide clean water for a village in Africa, that obviously that's going to be way better than like some rich people keeping it. But what Adam meant by the perverse incentives argument is that if you provide that money for this African village, you don't know how that's going to affect them in the long term. You know in the short term they will have some clean water, but now you don't know if they will invest their time in developing the purifying technologies that could allow them to have clean water in the long term. What we tell you is that it is very difficult to assess these kinds of things across the board, which means that you should be assessing utility for the person and the society that you can assess utility for, which is yourself. I'll take closing.
Peter, can you predict all the moral consequences of giving this speech? If you can't, should you be giving it?
I think I'm actually completely discounting this. I mean, like, how is me giving this speech at all similar to me, like, donating money? Like, I'm not taking something away from myself that I would like. This breath I don't actually need. I'm not donating this to someone else. So there's no assessment of, like, the utility, right? There's no assessment of whether or not I am worse off for giving this speech as compared to the rest of you, how much better off the rest of you are for hearing this speech. It's, like, completely discounting. Okay. So let's move on to the other implications of this. This is going to be the new constructive matter that we're talking about, that Adam started to talk about. So I think it's worth talking about the practical implications for a society that supports this moral philosophy. Because if we believe this to be moral, and a society were to say this, then we think that it actually affects us significantly. So Adam starts to tell you what is generally seen as kind of the capitalist line, that being able to get something for what you earn is what incentivizes people to work in an economy. And it's very easy for us as a very liberal-minded group to just kind of poo-poo that and say, like, poor people need it more, like the rich people are rich enough. But the fact is, remember, they are defending a very, very difficult standard here, which is that any luxury is something that you don't deserve. Any luxury is something that you should first be spending your money on helping poor people before you are allowed to have that luxury. That means that even people who we would consider to be middle class, who enjoy such luxury luxuries like television or something like that would not be allowed to enjoy those things and would have, we think, very much less incentive to do anything more than be a subsistence farmer, which is all they're going to be able to do by doing something much more productive in the economy, because no matter what they do, no matter how much they produce, they're only going to be able to morally, within society, bring themselves up to the level of basic living. They're only going to be able to bring themselves up to the level at which their basic needs are met. And we think that's a severe disincentive to being more productive in a society. The other thing that's important to note is that because people like luxuries, because we as a society like to improve our quality of life, there is a lot of industry, there's a lot of jobs centered on the idea that we can provide things that people enjoy but people don't necessarily need. A society that says that that is immoral, that providing these things such as like television or like an amusement park or anything like that, any number of things, I would posit even a majority of an industry are for luxury. Society says that it's not okay. It's a society that has much less potential to provide wealth for those who actually need it, has much less potential to have jobs for those who actually need it. For all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for his remarks, and now welcome the member of government representing Stanford to open up the second half of the debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in second proposition, we want to dive a little bit into some really meaty issues. We think they're pretty interesting. We hope you'll like them. The first one is how the process of the accumulation of wealth actually means that society has a stake in what you do. We're going to talk to you about the mechanism by which that happens. We're going to talk to you about what luxury is good for, what people spend their money on, and why they spend their money on that. And then we're going to talk to you a little bit about a collective action problem that results as a result of the first two. So let's talk to you first. I'm going to do a little bit of clarification, because we've heard in the last speech a little bit of like obfuscation regarding like where this line is, what reasonable is. Well, I mean, obviously reasonable for proposition is going to be different than reasonable for opposition. Surprise, surprise. But we're going to tell you that like a lot of things that we think are legitimate can be considered that aren't a base level. That there's a difference between reasonable and base. If you want to like, you know, have insurance for like being able to like, you know, against your job loss, if you want to be able to send your kids to school, like that's reasonable, that's fine. But further to which they kind of confuse like the order of magnitude of the stuff we're talking about. In the United States, 20% of the population owns 80% of the assets. 0.01% of the population owns like 5% of the total assets in the American economy. That means that the marginal dollar of those people is a lot. To put this in context, think of Bill Gates, right? He's worth about $60 billion. Do you know how many Alex Campbells that is? Okay, well I have no money, so it's a lot more than that. But like if I had $1, that means 60 billion of me equals one of him. So actually the orders of magnitude are very important. But let's move on to some interesting stuff. No, thank you. We think that the process of the accumulation of wealth happily rewards people who generate value. But this is at the end of this process that this comes. So the entrepreneur has educational infrastructure that gave them the tools to create that value, health infrastructure that kept them alive, technological platforms that allowed them to create something of value, financial infrastructure that gave them a platform to generate returns, and then a legal infrastructure which protected those returns. We think at each step in that value chain, society can make a claim on the returns. Society is an equity stakeholder in all of the people who cash out in the modern economy, I will tell you. Now, at the same time, we think that this can, because it's problematic to coercively remove these people's assets, we think we can make a moral claim as opposed to a financial claim on these assets. We can say you have a moral obligation and not a financial obligation to return these assets to the stakeholders from which you generated those returns. But now I want to talk to you about luxury goods, okay? What do people spend this money on? Because we haven't heard anything about this. We will tell you that people who have the marginal dollar use it instrumentally to communicate messages. The difference between a really nice belt and a really, really nice belt isn't actually observable to anybody but other rich people, right? Like, nobody has any idea what the really nice watches are until you, like, walk into the store and you're like, wow, that's 50,000, that's 10, I don't know, what the hell's the difference, right? The point, why is that the case, right? Why is somebody willing to spend $50,000? It's not because it's, like, extra shiny. It's because it sends a message to other rich people about their status and power of that position. We think that they're using this purpose instrumentally to demonstrate status and power. So first of all, we would question the legitimacy of that message, whether that's a moral thing to be able to do. That, like, the purchasing a bigger, nicer car is just a way of saying, I have power over you. I can control you or other people like you. We think that that's a little bit problematic on face. But second of all, if there is a value to this, if you think they should be able to demonstrate their position of power, why don't we allow them to do that in just a different way? So if they need a scoreboard, right, because we have this norm that you don't tell someone how much you make, you just show it to them on your wrist. So if they need a scoreboard, let's give them a real scoreboard. Let's say, how much did you donate to charity last year? Let's say, how much did you invest in the third world? Let's make it open and then make everyone wear like Timexes.
Yeah, so do you actually think that Bill Gates, for example, would have developed computers that have ended up helping us solve all sorts of mental
Yes, I do.
problems?
Yes, absolutely I do. Because the returns that he's gotten, and I like this argument by you, this idea that like they generate utility from this money, but I'm telling you the primary mechanism by which they generate utility is by a social status position that they get. There is no difference between 10 billion and 20 billion, I will tell you, except for the fact that you can say, I have a bigger than you. That's literally the difference. Because it makes no difference to like what you can buy, how many trips to Cabo you can take, like how many fancy things you can do. It's just a yardstick. So if you're going to have that yardstick, you should make it an open yardstick that happens to do well, as opposed to instrumentalizing your power over other people. Okay, we think it's better, like for example, instead of Rolex watches to be feeding mouths, instead of measure yardsticks of bottles of champagnes, we have water mains. Let's talk to you about collective action. We think at the same time, individuals who want to make a statement, who want to do good, are at a disadvantage. Because if they take their money and do good with it, they lose power and status among their peers. Because they can no longer buy the same experiences that people that have the same income bracket. Let me tell you, I go to business school, that happens all the time, right? Like, you literally can't talk about the things that your friends do if you decide to give all your money away. What we see is that if it's a norm, that everyone who's moral does this, then we have the same social hierarchy that currently exists. The utility that they think derives from buying luxury goods still exists, but the where you spend the money goes to good as opposed to a nicer watch. We think this is just a slam dunk case for providing all the same utility that they give you on their side of the house. And what it does is it breaks the collective action problem that we currently have, where the one or two individuals who want to do something moral cannot because they lose out on their social status and their positioning. So let's talk to you about what Op said. Okay, they said people deserve their just desserts. We say absolutely they deserve their just desserts, and they're getting it in just a different currency. They're getting it in how much good they have done. Further to which they say, like, well, you'll have a lot of problems through donating this money. We think you can still have those problems, but people can be competitive about how good their money goes to, right? Like, there's a new NGO called GiveWell, which evaluates the various charities and the effectiveness. We think that just as you can be competitive about how much money you give, you can be competitive about how much good you do. If they're saying there's unintended consequences, that's just an argument for saying do it better, not an argument for saying don't do it. This idea of like we're gonna like dump agriculture on like the poor African farmers. Yeah, then don't dump agriculture on the poor agriculture farmers. Like give them malaria nets, like and kill the domestic malaria net market, like and make everyone live forever. That's great. Okay, so what do we have? We have a well-intentioned opposition that's saying that people deserve returns from generating value. On second proposition, we say that it's absolutely the case, and that we should be able to provide that same incentive and the same returns, but use that money in a more appropriate way. We've also told you that at every step in the value chain, in creating this massive amount of wealth, society has an equity stake in you. That means they have upside. That means they get part of it. But because it's problematic for us to tell them that we have to force to give their money, we make a moral obligation because we have a moral claim. Thank you very much. We are very proud.
I thank that speaker very much for his remarks. And now the House is very happy to welcome the member of the opposition.
Mr. Chairman, I find it kind of telling that Alex begins his speech by telling you that there is large inequality in the world. We concede that. That may provide us an argument for restructuring capitalism. That's not what GovBench do in this debate, because this is a debate about how we should make choices within capitalist structures. What Stefan and I are going to bring you from closing up is that donation is not the way to free the poor in a capitalist world and within a capitalist system, that even if they're morally correct, they're not going to win this debate. That's going to be my first point of extension. My second point is going to be talking about why luxuries are vital for social life, for constituting identity, why that means they are actively something that people should purchase and should engage in, why it's not all just, as Alex cynically thinks, about power and status. Before that, a few points of rebuttal. Firstly, Alex tells us that the only reason that people buy luxuries is to send a message to other rich people. Steph and I would dispute the claim that only rich people have ever seen a branded good. We think there is a reason that poor people choose to buy knockoff versions of Louis Vuitton handbags and choose to attach brands to themselves even if they couldn't actually afford the clothes. We think there's a reason that incredibly poor African American kids want to emulate the bling that the rappers they worship have. It's not just about sending a message to other rich people, it's about sending a message to everybody. Then Alex says, well, let's make donation a scoreboard. Here's the problem with this, and we're going to go into this in more detail on a constructive. The problem with donation just being about status is that that means that donations will cure the sexy diseases, the causes that get the most media attention, not the things which actually matter to people in the developing world, and therefore the things that would actually improve their lives. Lastly, Alex says, do it better, right? That's like defeats any arguments we could possibly make about unintended consequence or bad donation. What we say, and what we're going to say, is we could say the same thing about capitalism. We think there are lots of very good examples of ways in which people can spend more ethically on things like fair trade goods, or not buying from companies that support genocide. We think those are things people should also do. We'll also do our system slightly better. So, let's talk about how we combat poverty. Because the underlying assumption that Gov have just never bothered to prove in this round is that donation actually works at making poor people's lives better. What we tell you is that, in general, the donation culture has failed. Look at the last 60 years of international development policy. Africa is now 40% poorer than it was 60 years ago, and has been primarily helped by donations from international NGOs. The East Asian tiger economies have got substantially richer over that period. They did that by selling goods which people wanted to consume, and crucially, producing those goods. That was the point of our POI, which Hart has totally misunderstood, is that sometimes when you spend money, somebody at the other end also has to buy that good and get something out of it as a result. Alex.
How's Europe doing with that Marshall Plan?
Okay, so state-coordinated assistance may well be a good thing. That's not what your model does. We think there are many reasons to believe that higher taxes might be a legitimate way of helping people in a way that random, uncoordinated donations to causes that rich people decide they like aren't. Indeed, that's a large part of this argument. So, why is it that we think in general donation is a bad way of helping the poor? Firstly, it's about a culture of empowerment. Treating somebody as an agent who you ask to perform a service for you in a fair transaction is very different from donating to somebody because you think they are worthy of your pity. That affects the way you see things. Secondly, we tell you that often the way individual charitable donations occur is based on the whims of donors. That's why HIV/AIDS is funded totally disproportionately in the research community to its actual significance as a disease that needs to be cured, compared with other diseases like yellow fever, because it's been able to capture the media market and so becomes important because of people's whims. Thirdly, we tell you that the way donation works isn't just like, I'm rich, I send some of my money to an identifiable person in another country, and they decide how to spend it. No, you give it to a charity or to an organisation that tells them what their priorities should be. That means that oftentimes international NGOs don't actually seek out the most important issues in these communities. That's why, for instance, the way malaria was basically got rid of in West Africa was by a business that sought to sell malaria nets fairly cheaply, rather than by NGOs who were using really clunky methods of giving it out. No thanks, guys. And what we tell you is that every time you donate money to charity, you reinforce the problematic structures of donation I've just spoken about, and you dictate the terms of the relationship to those poor people. We tell you instead, Olop, that you need to work within capitalist structures in order to make these people better off. It may seem abhorrent, but the fact is that sweatshop labour does make people in the developing world substantially better off because it gives them something rather than nothing. That's the actual choice in this round. Secondly, let's talk about where luxuries allow people to meaningfully constitute their social identities. No thanks, guys. And we tell you that, broadly speaking, we think this rebuts the very impersonal system of morality that we get from opening government that says, just think about what it would be like if you didn't have any identity and you didn't know who you were, tells you, in fact, what's genuinely meaningful to people. What we tell you is that we agree with Alex that many luxury goods are a vital part of the way people are assessed within society. That is, by the way, not just true of the super rich, right? That's why poor people often choose to forego things that might seem objectively better, like eating slightly more food, in return for having slightly more expensive luxury goods that help to constitute their identities. And what we tell you is that luxury goods are meaningfully differentiated in a way that necessities aren't, and therefore allow you to constitute your identity and social life more effectively. So, for instance, it might be a good idea for me to keep some of my money and choose to spend that on t-shirts I know were bought fairly, because that allows me to express my identity as an ethical consumer within a capitalist economy. Secondly, because luxuries do just condition a huge amount of the way we live our lives, right? So, for instance, the choice between a BlackBerry and an iPhone does actually, to some extent, meaningfully differentiate whether or not you consider yourself more about business or about leisure. In much the same way, we say often people who choose to spend enormous amounts of money on, say, hip-hop albums or hip-hop labels want to express a link to a particular African-American identity. Ultimately, luxuries are therefore about allowing you to constitute your culture, to link yourself to a religion by buying a large, flashy cross, by linking yourself to your heritage by buying a big gun and going hunting to say you are a rural American. And that's what that means. Ladies and gentlemen, what we tell you is that these things are vital parts of social life, and they are much better than spending money in a way that doesn't free the poor in the developing world. We oppose.
I thank that speaker very much for his remarks, and the House is now pleased to welcome the closing speaker for the government bench, the government whip.
I have to admit, I'm a little bit confused, because I think the crux of what I just heard is, if you give too much money to charity, how will anybody know what culture you affiliate with? I mean, first of all, boo-hoo us, because apparently helping people is less important than people knowing identify with hip-hop. But I think that this is just a silly argument to make to begin with, right? Because I think the culture that you can identify with is who you choose to help, right? Like, are you choosing to help inner-city kids? I think maybe that's into the hip-hop culture, so on and so forth. So I think this notion that the only way in which you can have an identity is by buying the right t-shirt, it's feeding into the sort of perverse, message-sending, consumeristic policies that is exactly what Alex tells you has a total bankruptcy of any moral force, and we didn't hear any response to that. They did have some more intelligent things to say about markets. I'll get to that a little bit later. The second thing that I just want to say right off the bat is that, like, look, charity doesn't work. Take a look at the difference over the last 60 years between East Asia and Africa. Do you know what happened in Africa about 60 years ago? AIDS, guys. I mean, that's why we've seen a regression of policies and life savings and sort of the general economic standards in Africa, because the life expectancies have gone down. I don't think you can say, because charity occurred, people stopped being good at, like, doing economic goods. I don't think that makes any sense. Finally, he just basically concedes, yes, charity when it is good works. For instance, the Marshall Plan. Now, nothing about the way in which charity was applied by the Marshall Plan requires it to be part of a government. You could similarly have an NGO with similarly clever policies. So the question then is, who gives you the opportunity to have that sort of good on their side of the house? It's got to be our side of the house, right? Because by encouraging more charity, we think there's going to be some sort of competition between charities. And when people want to do the most good with their work, they want to point to the fact that my dollars went to this organization which did this awesome thing. We think that that leads to better charities, and lead to precisely the kind of good that they admitted can occur, and occurs much more often on our side of the house. With that, I want to ask 3 questions. First, does the system that makes us successful have a moral claim on us? Second, is there an obligation to give, and can that be squared with incentives to still create cool stuff? And finally, I'm going to take a look at whether the concerns that we're given on a pragmatic basis override the moral basis of our argumentation and the pragmatic goods that we're promising. I'll get to you guys a little bit later. So what Alex tells you is that the system into which you were born, the system that allows you to be successful, has a moral claim on you. Because the only reason you can accumulate wealth in the first place, the only reason you can have protections of your intellectual property, the only reason that you're privy to information from the society that's come before you, the only reason that you have an educational infrastructure is because there is a system in place that everybody agrees to, whether it's all of us in this room and everybody internationally. As a result, when you benefit from being part of that system has a stake in you. Notice that we really hear nothing from opposition to counter this argument, because I think it kind of blows their mind and they frankly agree with it. So the point being that if you fundamentally believe that not everything that you gain was because of you and you alone, but was fundamentally in some way facilitated, yes, by the people in Africa, by the labor that allowed you to have the goods, that allowed you to get the cogs, that maybe went into your TI-83 calculator, that allowed you to have the education necessary to come up with all the things you needed to learn to do all the awesome things that you did, then that surely means that you have a moral obligation to give back, because the moral basis of what you have gained is not from you and you alone. I'll take you.
Okay, so then do you think that because society gave me the gun and gave me the circumstance in which I killed someone else, that society has a 100% stake in my crime and that I shouldn't be punished?
Notice how I said you should give some money back and not all money you ever gained? And I think that the answer to your question is yes, society does have some attribution as to what happened. That's why we have mitigating factors in sentences when they take a look at the fact that you were beaten, you were kicked out of school, society did horrible things to you. So we're completely fine with defending them. So what has Alex proven in this round that's gone completely uncontested? That the wealth that you are claiming today is not yours and yours alone. It's been made possible by the contributions of individuals throughout society, internationally, and that's why you owe something to them on a moral level. So we have an obligation to give. The question then is, does this obligation to give become corrosive to the incentive structure that allows you to create things? And I think it's an interesting analysis that we get from the opening opposition, because we want things like technological advantage. But I think what Alex tells you here is that the reason people crave money, crave this sort of like feedback, is not because they're just necessarily getting these awesome goods that are good in and of themselves, but because of the messages these goods allow them to transmit. Because they get to demonstrate their social power and their place in the social hierarchy. Now the response we hear to that is like, look, not only the ultra-rich buy socially message-sending things, like other people buy brands too. Yes, because I'm not wearing a polo sweater, that tells you that Alex's business school is going to make more money than me. It doesn't mean that this social hierarchy and sending of messages works only in the land of Bill Gates, right? It works for all of us. I think that the point then becomes that if we shift these incentives, and now instead of having like a little like horse on his like silly sweater, he now has like a little counter that showed the number of lives he's now saved. And his number was higher than me. You still have the same incentive, the same amount of money, right? Marginally over my sweater. So the point then being that the entire concern that people no longer want to create things doesn't make any sense, because what Alex and I are proposing is shifting where value comes from. And once we have that value preserved, you still have an incentive to create things. We don't think that's causing a problem.
Okay, so what is the amount of money that you want people to give back to the society that helped them create that wealth, not just taxation?
Because the taxation only goes to the individuals within their micro-society, and we think that there's contributions and moral obligations that go beyond that. That's a very simple answer to that question. So, the last question then is, do we think that the concerns that they've talked about override the pragmatic gains we're giving you, and can this charity work? Just quickly, on the notion of charities working, we clearly could just list a litany of examples in which charities do work, and they could give us a litany of examples in which charities don't work. What does this mean? I think here's the fundamental crux of the analysis here. Whenever you try and enact a program, in this case charity, by having to experiment, because we don't know how charity works in an optimal way, there's going to be programs that don't work. The question then becomes, is charity something we think we should do? And we think that's the answer to that question has been shown to be yes. We should find the ideal way to remove structural barriers for the poor. We should find the ideal way to educate people, to get them water. Are there going to be some unintended consequences? Yes. But we don't think you should make the perfect the enemy of the good here. It is only through more experimentation, more funds allocated to this problem, that you're going to get a realization of what better charity is going to be. Then all we're left with then is this notion that only sexy diseases are going to be solved. But here's the cool thing. After you solve the sexy diseases, other diseases that weren't previously sexy then become sexy. So over time, you do a lot of good. There's a moral obligation on all of us because of the system that made us successful. We can still have all the awesome stuff we have, and we think we can do a lot of good over time.
I thank that speaker very much for his remarks and welcome the final speaker of the debate to represent the opposition whip.
So I'm a bit bemused that I started my course at Oxford at the beginning of this year in international development, a bleeding heart liberal who donated money despite having massive student loans coming out of undergraduate. And I'm probably going to exit at the end of next year, believing fundamentally that we don't have society structured in a way that makes that a useful decision. I think that what they make the mistake of on their side of the house is claiming that we get all of these benefits by creating a consistent underclass that is functionally reliant upon an upper class that then gets to choose by their own whims what is best for them. It gives the upper class the opportunities to select what they get to do, and it denies the people throughout the rest of the world the possibility to make those decisions for themselves, holds them to higher moral standards by dictating the terms upon which they receive goods, and forces them to behave in ways we would never force our own citizens to. These are the shackles that they are creating through the donation systems they're promoting. These are the shackles that we think we have to undermine on our side of the house. 3 major points. First, how does capitalism work? Second, how do donations work? And third, why do we think luxuries are actually a pretty good thing on our side? So on the idea of capitalism, Ben gives you a pretty good example, or a pretty good comparative between what's been going on in Africa in the past 60 years, which is basically the beginning of decolonization for most of the continent, and what's been happening in East Asia in terms of the economies that have developed there, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, sort of what approach did they take? And what he tells you is that in East Asia, people ended up producing goods that were desirable. What goods were they producing? Well, it was companies like Hyundai. It was companies like Samsung. It was companies that were producing luxuries that were desirable to the developing world that created the impetus for development throughout places like South Korea, throughout places like Thailand. We think that's hugely important and hasn't been addressed. Onish's only response to this is to say, oh, well, what's been going on in Africa for the past 60 years? AIDS. His math is wrong, right? AIDS has only been around since like the 1980s, but setting that aside, that's not the reason Africa is underdeveloped. The reason Africa is underdeveloped is because it doesn't have industries that allow people to make money. It doesn't. It's pretty important. And when you don't have industries that allow people to make money, you know what that means? It means you don't have domestic markets. And you aren't able to get out of that unless you have external markets. And where do you think those come from? The people who are spending money on luxury goods that are made abroad. We think that's hugely important. We think that's something they don't get out of their side. Sure.
Ma'am, a lot of the reason that Africa has no industry is because they have no infrastructure. Do you concede that it's possible to do well by actually building a road or no?
Yeah, I think it's important, and I think that people are right now building roads as a result of centrally coordinated systems that are funded by state money, and I think that I'll get to that in my second point, which is sort of why donations fail on a sort of case-by-case basis, whereas central coordination via systems like taxation, via systems like USAID, no thank you, actually do create these improvements in people's lives. The system you're advocating, guys, is not one in which you say, well, I'm just going to give all my money to the government, and then they're going to start allocating things, because that's taxation. The system you're advocating is one in which I, as an individual, get to have a counter on my lapel that says where I gave my money, who I gave it to, and what benefits I get to claim as a result of my capitalist superiority to the people living in the developing world because of the fact that I made money and they didn't. We think that's fundamentally problematic in terms of the message it sends, but it also means you don't deliver to the results that you want. So it's not the reason. Africa is not doomed because of AIDS. Africa is having problems right now, in fact, as a result of lack of infrastructure and as a result of lack of centrally coordinated systems that focus on its most pressing issues. Because people aren't donating money to roads in Africa, they're donating to HIV/AIDS, and that's a tremendous issue. No, thank you. So what we do see is that production allows people the opportunity to spend money as you choose, right? We think that the structures that they're endorsing, that is to say charities and donation, force people to accept money in particular formats, that is to say in the format of malaria net, or in the format of antiretrovirals, when people might not be making those decisions for themselves. We don't force ourselves to make decisions in that same sort of way, right? To say, you know, this is what I'm going to buy, or that's what I'm going to buy, as a result of it being dictated to me. We do it as a result of individual decision making, and we think that we should be held to the same standards as people abroad. And we think that production allows them the opportunity to be able to do that. They say, well, first off, society gives you 100% stake, right? The society gives you money, society gives you the resources that allow you to become Bill Gates. As a result, you should be able to have some sort of stake in Bill Gates' money. We think we cover that through taxation, first off, and I'll take you in a moment. And the second thing that we think we tell you is that there's still something unique about Bill Gates that should allow him to keep his money. And that the unique thing about Bill Gates is probably going to manifest itself in a pair of extraordinarily geeky spectacles as a result of his consumption decisions. But we think that it's Bill Gates' choice to be able to send that message, that he identifies with that sort of nerdy subculture. I'll get to that in my later point. Sure.
At the very beginning of this round, we asked you to consider this debate from the perspective of those who need the aid. Do you honestly believe that someone who needs food aid to survive would be persuaded by your argument?
What I honestly believe is that the system you are creating is not one that gets food aid to that person. And I do genuinely believe that. I will stand by that argument. Because what you aren't doing is creating a long-term system for them to be able to survive and thrive. You are setting up a system in which you, as an upper class in society, are able to dictate the terms in which they receive particular goods. No, thank you. And you aren't allowing them to be able to set up societies in ways that they find desirable. You're instead dictating what happens to be your social values for other people. And yes, we think food aid is something that a lot of people agree on. But when it comes to other sort of moral gray areas in terms of what constitutes suffering, it gets a lot hazier. So how do donations work? Let's just get into this straight away. What we tell you is that central coordination, no thank you, is the best way to go about being able to distribute this money. The reason central coordination is better is because technocrats are able to sort of look at the lay of the land, right? They're the ones who are paid to be able to see what the issues are within various societies, what is most pressing, what's most in need, and then they make the allocations based on that. I, Steph Bell, can't really do much of that on my own. I don't have the time. It's a lot better to focus on the sort of governmental systems that allow people to be able to make more intelligent decisions, right? And so what we tell, and Anish says, well, you know what, eventually old diseases or other diseases are going to become sexy. But what we tell you is that the system that entrenches those diseases in the developing world, and the system that denies people the opportunity to make their own consumption decisions and make their own decisions about what they want to do with their lives, is still fundamentally broken. So even if the old decisions become sexy, saying that you get to save people in Africa is still fundamentally problematic in terms of the ways in which you conceive of your relation to the rest of the world. So third and final thing, why do we think luxuries are important in individual decisions? And I know you guys think this is a ridiculous argument on your side of the house. You're sort of obliged to. But what we tell you is that it isn't just a decision that's made by the rich. It isn't just a decision that's made by, Bill Gates or Warren Buffett as to how they spend their money. We see consistently people over time making decisions that we would not make for them, in terms of we would choose to provide them medical care, and they, as an individual, choosing between medical care and a nicer pair of shoes, or an opportunity to send signals about which musical subculture they prefer, they pick the latter. We think it isn't just about power, it's about making statements of individual expression and self-actualization that all of us throughout the developed world are allowed to make all the time. What we think is you should allow those opportunities to people in the developing world as well. We think it's problematic not to. We're happy to oppose.